Okay, so this is the new and improved recording for Chapter 8 in the History and Systems of Psychology. In this case, we are looking at the beginnings of experimental psychology as we know it today. And that begins with this guy, Wilhelm Wundt, who, if you think back to Chapter 7, we might think that many of the people that were mentioned there, and even some in Chapter 6, sound like experimental psychologists, people like Helmholtz and Fechner. But the idea here is that these guys consider themselves to be first and foremost physiologists, and the word psychology was still associated with kind of Platonic thinking, right? The study of the psyche and the mind, and it was therefore seen as not very scientific, but more philosophical. And it was Wundt who was the first to use the phrase experimental psychologist, arguing that these previously philosophical questions could actually become experimental questions, that is, empirical questions, questions that could be tested through observation and scientific investigation. And so when Wundt created his laboratory at the University of Leipzig there in 1879, he called it the Institute of Experimental Psychology. And this was the first use of that term, so therefore Wundt gets to be the first experimental psychologist. Now, being in Germany, he's influenced primarily by German philosophy. So Kant, as mentioned back in Chapter 6, is considered something of almost really a national hero in Germany, to the extent that his philosophy was so important. And even prior to that, Leibniz as well. And what they both have in common is that they were both rationalists, right? They believed in some innate knowledge of some form coming into the mind. For Kant, it was the innate categories. For Leibniz, it was a little different. And they both argued that we have an active mind. Right? Leibniz, talking about the rational monads, talked about our ability for rational thought, logical thinking. Kant talked about the idea that the mind actively interprets sensations using top-down processing. So in that sense, they were opposed to the kind of passive approach of the empiricist school, right? Passive associationistic kinds of learning. The mind is more active. And they were also, to some extent, dualists, right? That they argued that the mind was somehow different than the body. And this quote at the bottom is from Wundt himself, so we see that Wundt is studying the mind, and that not the brain or the body. So he's not a physiologist. He doesn't consider himself to be a physiologist. He considers himself to be a psychologist, right? And so this quote here says that materialism is, quote, contradicted by the fact of consciousness itself, which cannot possibly be derived from any physical qualities of matter, end quote. And so what he means there is that just the mere experience of having a thought, of having consciousness, of having awareness, is fundamentally different, qualitatively different, than what it means to be a material or physical object. Thoughts are not physical objects. Thoughts are different. And this echoes again what Kant was saying about the two kinds of reality, right? There was the noumenal world, which is objects unto themselves, things as they exist. And then there is the phenomenal world, which is the world of perception, the world as it appears to us, the world of the mind, really, right? So we have things, and then there are ideas, and the ideas correspond to things. And this is an important part of phenomenal of psychology, because the idea of consciousness itself is that it is made of phenomenal experience. It is made of perceptual experience and ideas. We'll have a little bit more about the issue of phenomenal experience or phenomenology later in these notes. But first, we'll deal with Wundt's actual research. This school of thought is called voluntarism. Now, if you think back to maybe your general psychology class, Chapter 1 of those books tend to mention Wundt as being one of the founders of experimental psychology, but they probably don't use the word voluntarism, but instead use the word structuralism. It's important to note that, well, long story short, all of those books are wrong. Structuralism is properly the school invented by one of Wundt's students, Tishner, who is mentioned in a couple more slides here. And Wundt's school was voluntarism. And the idea here is that for Wundt, one of the most important things as far as his theory of psychology is all about is that he believed that, again, the mind is active, echoing Kant, and that that means that we have an agency, right? That we have some control over our own thoughts and behavior, right? And that's our agency, but that is governed by something, and that something is the will. So when we talk about whether or not we have a free will, the idea is the will is our internal agency, and whether it is unconstrained by prior causes or not is the debate of free will versus determinism. For Wundt, he doesn't care too much about that debate, but he basically argues that the will is actively choosing what we think about and how we interpret the world. And so for him, that's voluntary behavior, right? The will engages in voluntary behavior. And therefore, the goal of psychology is to study that process. And so he believes then that the will is central to all psychological experience. And therefore, perception, attention, and mental chronometry, all of these things make up what Wundt was studying. It's really pretty much a very early kind of cognitive psychology with these kinds of topics. Now, he didn't use the word attention, in fact, so let me clarify here that he uses another word called apperception. And so there's perception and then there's apperception. And so apperception is kind of a stage of processing that occurs after perception. And so nowadays no one uses that term, but instead the word attention kind of captures the same basic idea. Apperception determines, there's lots of perceptual data coming in through all of your five senses, but we only really pay attention to some small part of it. And that's what these 19th century psychologists used to call the apperceptive mass, which is what you're currently thinking about right now, which nowadays we call that working memory, but back then it was the apperceptive mass, and it's the active attention or apperception that admits that information into the mind. Mental chronometry, the word chronometry here just means time measurements, right? So chronos for time, metry for measurement, and the idea is that his claim is that the behavior of the will takes time. It has to engage in processes and stages that take time, and he wants to measure the durations of these processes to understand them better. But in order to really understand the role of the will, we also have to understand Wundt's broader theory of consciousness. And we see here that he has this theory that there are, in fact, two levels of consciousness. One is called, at the top there, immediate experience, and at the bottom, mediate experience. So a subtle difference in the names there. And what's important is that immediate experience is where the will is most centrally involved, whereas mediate experience involves some parts of psychology and mind that do not really directly involve the will. The will represents our conscious experience. So, for example, when we perceive the world, or as I mentioned, attend and apperceive the world, we are conscious. We are immediately conscious and aware of those experiences, and that's why, of course, Wundt calls it immediate experience. So the acts of perception and apperception are part of immediate experience. And so is something else that he calls creative synthesis. Creative synthesis involves taking ideas that we have and synthesizing them with other ideas that we have to create larger ideas, concepts, and categories. So this is similar to some extent to the associationistic ideas of Locke and others from the British empiricist school, but it is not a passive associationistic view. Rather, it is an active one, that we can actively create linkages between ideas. And it is this kind of psychology that Wundt believes can be studied using his experimental techniques. And so his experimental techniques, I have them listed right there. Psychophysics is one. So he did do some psychophysics, not a lot, but it was a part of that. And he considered this to be a way in which we're studying experience, right? Studying perception. Mental chronometry, as previously mentioned, is part of apperception and perhaps also creative synthesis. These are processes that can be measured. And then also introspection, which is one of those techniques that, again, thinking back to your general psych chapter 1 type issues, is that this was usually mentioned as the first kind of method of psychology. But important to note here that while Wundt did deploy it, it was not really a central part of his theory either. It's really a bigger part of the structuralist school that was created by Tishner. And in fact, they also use called it internal perception. What does that mean? It means that when we engage in what we might call external perception, we are perceiving the outside world, and internal perception involves perceiving our inside world. That means perceiving our own minds, perceiving our own thought processes. And so the idea is that if we want to study something experimentally, we want it to be empirical. That means to be observable, right? And so the idea is that maybe we should be able to observe our own minds, and that would become a scientific way of investigating the mind, is to observe it. But of course, you can only observe your own private subjective experiences, not the private subjective experiences of other people. So there's some limitations, of course, with that. On the other hand, though, immediate experience does not involve the will. It involves things that are relevant because it involves the human mind and consciousness to some extent, but it does not involve conscious awareness and immediate experience. So I'm calling it here a posteriori reasoning, and what that means is just after the fact reasoning about an experience. But another way to think about this is to think about something like culture. Culture is a pattern or a regularity that emerges between people in a group, right? In a large group, particularly in a society or in a community. And in that sense, no one individual, and therefore no one will within that community consciously creates that culture, but rather it's something that just emerges out of interactions between humans. So it is a part of the human mind. It is a product of the human mind, right, in groups like that. But it is clearly not a product of any individual will, right? We don't consciously create culture. It's more of a, if you want to use the word unconscious, we could potentially call that unconscious mind at this point. And certainly the idea of an unconscious mind was gaining in popularity primarily in Germany, in Austria, where Freud was in the late 19th century. So if you can't study, if this doesn't involve the will, if immediate experience does not involve the will, how do you study it? You can't use the experimental techniques listed in the top half of this slide, so rather you have to do things like you have to study culture. You can study cultural anthropology, right? Comparative cultural analysis. You can look at other things like myths and how myths might reflect underlying psychological processes, right? This was a big deal for one famous student of mythology, Joseph Campbell. And looking also at literature, language, religion, all of these things kind of emerge as a product of society and culture, but they are so they're relevant to the mind, but they are not created by any individual will. Now let's take a look at this mental chronometry business, because this was the biggest part of Wundt's work. And so he was studying here apperception, right? The act of attending to or apperceiving things in the world. And he comes up with this, what he calls a thought meter, which, as you can see in the picture, is nothing more than just a pendulum clock mounted on the wall. But notice there's also a graduated scale mounted on the wall below it, and some markings on the wall. And also notice there's a crossbar attached to the pendulum that can strike one of two bells on either side as it swings. So the task here is relatively straightforward. Wundt will start the pendulum swinging, and it will swing between two extremes that are marked on the wall there with the letters D and B. And as it reaches the end of its arc, it will strike one of those bells, right? That crossbar will strike one of the bells mounted on the side. Now the subject, abbreviated S here on the slide, the subject is simply, they have one job, which is as soon as they hear the bell ring, they have to note where was the pendulum along the scale. Was it exactly at point D or B, or was it maybe one hash mark over or two hash marks over? Of course, it's supposed to be exactly at D and B, right? But it turns out that the participants were wrong. They did not correctly judge it as being at those locations. Instead, they judged it as being a couple of hash marks over. Now, that shouldn't, at first glance, it shouldn't really be likely that they would be wrong here, right? Because they never take their eyes off the pendulum. They don't have to just look at the bell or anything. They just keep their eye watching the pendulum as it swings over that scale. But nevertheless, they still end up being wrong a little bit. And one's claim is that what's going on here is that the first thing that subjects are doing is they're using their ears, right? So even though their eyes are following the pendulum, their attention is actually directed at the auditory input. They're waiting for that bell. And as soon as they detect the bell, they have to recognize that it happened and then redirect or shift their attention back to their visual inputs to then attend or apperceive where is the pendulum. And in this case, that process takes time. As Blunt estimated, it takes about 1/10 of a second because he was, by measuring how many tick marks or hash marks away from the correct location participants' judgments were, he could then calculate the time it takes for that pendulum to travel that distance and then estimate the time delay involved here, right? And so this is a measurement of the process of the internal switching of attention between auditory and visual inputs, about 1/10 of a second. So here we see that here we are studying something that cannot be really directly observed, right? We can't look into the minds of others to study their apperceptive processes, but nevertheless, it can be measured in an objective way. And so for what this is experimental psychology. As mentioned, one of his students was Tishner. And Tishner is perhaps one of the most famous students, and it was really Tishner who, after leaving Wundt's laboratory and receiving his degree there, that he came to the United States and he created really the psychology department at Cornell University in New York. And that was where he really extended his introspection research and created what we know as the structuralist school of thought. Why is it called structuralism? Because he believed that the mind has a structure, right? That there is an inherent structure to the mind. Now, what does that mean? Well, take a look at this idea of reductionism that I have in the middle here. Consciousness is something that's difficult to understand. And so if we find a way to take something that's very complex and difficult to understand, and we break it down into simpler bits and pieces, simpler units, and these simple units are therefore easier to understand because they are simple, this means that we can do away with the harder problems of studying consciousness by simplifying things, right? Breaking things down into basic units. And that's really what Tishner's goal is here. Is he wants to take the mind or consciousness and he wants to figure out how to analyze it down into some basic unit, how to break it down into its most fundamental underlying structure. One analogy that I like to use is to think of a building, right? And what are the basic units of a building? What is its structure? Well, we could talk about the units in terms of maybe the bricks that are used to build it, but also the rules for how bricks go together, which includes, of course, the plans or the blueprint of the building. And so that's the structure that Tishner is getting at for the mind. He wants to know what the basic units of the mind are, and then what are the rules for how these units have to be put together to create the overarching structure of the mind. And this is where he's using introspection. He wants people to have an experience, and then he wants them to introspect about this experience, to then report on what were the fundamental building blocks of that experience. Now I have on the next slide here this picture of a cow. In a classroom setting, I would try to use PowerPoint to flash this image on the screen very, very quickly. Let me go to the next slide for that purpose. It doesn't work very well in these recorded videos, but the reason that I would do it, try to present that image very, very briefly, is because that's what Tishner was doing. He was using a device common in experimental psychology in the late 1800s called a tachistoscope or T-scope, so you don't have to say that long word all the time. And it was a device that was designed to be able, obviously before there were computers and televisions and so forth, to be able to present images very rapidly, right? Just you see it for a fraction of a second and that's it. And there's a reason he wanted to do that, is that Obviously, if I go back to this picture, if you just stare at it, you're thinking about what it is, right? And he doesn't want you to spend too much time staring at the image and thinking about what it is. He simply just wants to have this fleeting impression, which creates a brief experience, and then he wants you to think more about your experience, right? So it's going to move from the picture to just a blank screen, and then you're supposed to introspect about the experience that you just had. What's important here is that Tishner does not want people to say, hey, I saw a cow on a farm, in a green field, because he calls that the stimulus era, right? So you're not supposed to name it. That's kind of trivial, right? To just be able to look at a picture and name what you're seeing. Instead, his argument is that you should describe how you have that knowledge, right? What happens in the mind before you are consciously aware that you're looking at a picture of a cow? What kinds of elemental building block types of things are occurring? Now, as you might imagine, this is something of a strange kind of experiment. If you imagine that you're an undergraduate student at Cornell in 1890 and you're in this laboratory and this guy is asking you to look at this picture very briefly and then try to describe your experiences, what are you going to say? What are you going to try to figure out? How do you respond? And so this means that it was a difficult experiment, and his participants didn't exactly know how they were to respond. So Tishner had to coach them to some extent, right? He would say, they might ask him, what is it you really want me to say here? And he might say, well, I want to understand your sensations, right? What sensations occur before you have perception, right? So this is in that process of going back to that four-step theory of going sensation, something happens, and then you get perception. And Tishner essentially wants people to introspect about steps 2 and 3 in that theory, right? What are the sensations, and what are the processes that bind them together to create the perceptual whole, right? And that's the building blocks and the rules with how they go together. And they simply don't know what he means. And so they have to say, well, what's a sensation? What do you expect me to say here? And well, then he might say, well, in the case of that picture of the cow, he might say, well, you saw maybe some black splotchy areas and some white splotchy areas, and they seemed to belong together somehow, but then there were some green areas that were disconnected. And they're like, oh, okay, I'll say that. And then he would continue to show them more and more images, and they would give the same kinds of answers. And if they gave the answers that were the kinds of things he was looking for, he would keep them around. And in fact, he did have a group of about a dozen participants that continued to come back to his laboratory, and he would pay them to come back to do more studies over the years. And as you might guess, if you've had your research methods class, this violates pretty much all of the guidelines of what you learn is good science, because here this is full of experimenter bias, right? That he's essentially telling the subjects how they should respond, rather than just letting them respond freely. And then, of course, he only uses participants who give him the answers that he wants to hear. So it would be of no surprise that no other researchers were able to replicate the kinds of findings that Tishner was doing. And so, of course, structuralism never really catches on. It's really just Tishner that's doing this kind of work. This other image of a cow I also have here in the slides, just to capture the idea of what Tishner meant by a reductionist approach to the mind. That you see here a cow, right? But what it's made of is a bunch of meaningless bits and pieces, right? It's just a collection of little pixels, of squares, right? Individually, there's no cow in any one of those pixels, right? None of those things. But somehow we're able to put it all together to recognize it as being a cow. And that's kind of, by analogy, what Tishner believes is happening in the mind when we perceive the world, is that we experience a bunch of visual sensations that are individually meaningless and just a patchwork of colors and so forth, and somehow we put it all together to create a perceptual whole. This takes us to our next major field in German psychology, which is called phenomenology, and I used that word at the beginning of the notes here. If you recall, with Kant, He divides reality into the noumenal world and the phenomenal world. And the phenomenal world is the world of the mind. But let's think a little bit more about what that means. So we have to think about the word meaning itself, right? What is meaning? It's a funny question. Have you ever asked what is the meaning of meaning? Right? What does it mean to have meaning? Well, the idea is that meaning is something unique to the mind, to ideas in the mind. Objects in and of themselves don't have meaning. For example, I got my flash drive laying here. It's just a thing, right? And as a thing, just a thing, it has no meaning. It just is. But on the other hand, especially if I put it away, we can think about it. I have an idea of it. I have a mental representation of it. And this mental representation is a different kind of a thing than the thing itself, right? And what makes it different is that the mental representation has meaning. But what is meaning? Well, meaning is to stand for something else, to refer to something outside of itself. So the object itself doesn't stand for anything. It doesn't refer to anything outside of itself, but rather it just is, right? But the idea stands for something, right? It stands for the actual thing. And so the study of meaningful experiences is phenomenology, right? The study of meaningful experience. And this makes it very different from what Titchener is doing, because if you think about Titchener trying to be a reductionist and to strip consciousness down into these little meaningless bits and pieces, like in that last little patchwork image of the cow there, that this is meaningless psychology, Titchener, and structuralism. And so phenomenology is really a rejection of that it's meaningful experience. And so Brentano is at the forefront of this field with his approach, which is called act psychology. And so his idea is that consciousness is defined by intentionality, which is a pretty difficult concept here. We use this word intentional all the time. I say, did you do that intentionally? I'm asking, did you do it on purpose? But what I really mean, philosophically, is that I'm asking, did you have a thought behind the action? Was there a thought process? Was there something going on in your mind prior to the outward behavior? And so he says that the mind contains intentions, and it engages in intentional acts. So what are these intentional acts? Well, he defined more than just those three that I have listed there, presentation, judging, and desire, but let's talk about those three as an example. In fact, let's start with the bottom, desire. So to engage in the act of desire is a mental act. It occurs phenomenologically, right, in the mind. But it's important to note that in Brentano's view, it is not possible to just exist in a state of desire, right? You have to desire something. Desire has to be directed towards something. It's like in language with a basic sentence structure, you have a subject and an object, right? And so the idea here is that this is the same kind of thing. Is there's a subject, desire, and there's an object, the thing desired, right? So what is the thing that's desired? Well, of course, it could be anything, right? I could say I desire a glass of water. But what's also important here is that when I say I desire a glass of water, that act of desire is not directed towards a real glass of water. It's directed toward my mental representation of a glass of water, right? I can think about a glass of water, and then I can say I desire that, what I'm thinking about. So here, what's going on here is that intentionality is defined as an internal mental intentional act that is directed towards an internal mental thing, right? A mental representation. And that's what we'll say is the referent of the act, right? That the act has to have a referent. And so judging, likewise, we don't just exist in a state of judgment, but rather we have to be judging something. There has to be a referent. And then lastly with presentation, I saved this for last because it's a little bit more abstract, but if I think about that glass of water again, I can imagine it, I can visualize it, I can have a mental image of it. And this internal act of visualization is what Brentano calls presentation. It's almost as if you have this mind's eye that's viewing the mind's glass of water, right? This internal theater of the mind, and that's what the act of presentation is. And again, of course, it has to have a referent. There has to be something viewed within the mind, or seen or imagined within the mind. So this idea, there's a few funny ideas that come from this, like the object exists within the act, or this is what Brentano calls immanent objectivity. And what he means by this is that the object itself comes into existence the moment we think about it. Obviously not the real object, but the thought, right? We have all these ideas, we have all these thoughts that we can think about at any point in time, but we're not normally thinking about them. For example, you are not currently thinking about a giraffe, but now that I've said that, you are. And where did that giraffe in your mind come from? Well, it came from the act of presentation. And the act of presentation is directed at the image or representation of the giraffe, and now it exists in your mind, and that's what gives it its immanent objectivity. And then, of course, it goes away as soon as you stop thinking about it. But this is how Brentano defines mind. Consciousness itself, intentional, meaningful experience, is composed of acts and their representations that they're directed toward, and that you cannot have one without the other. And what this also means then is that you cannot have a reductionist, structuralist type of approach to studying phenomenal experience, because that would involve trying to strip that meaningful experience down into something simpler than that. And as far as Brentano is concerned, you can't do that. If you do that, you're not studying mind anymore. Mind is the study of a meaningful experience, nothing more, and nothing less especially. And so following on that, Brentano also talked about how it is possible that we can study meaningful experience, to study the mind. So he has defined 3 methods here. Now, this does not mean that he advocates for all 3 of these methods, because in fact, with the first one, direct inner observation, this is Brentano's name for what Tishner was doing, which Brentano disagrees with. So inner observation, again, is like the internal perception, the introspection, but in this case, direct. So what's happening here is that, go back to the picture of the cow. Tishner is asking his subjects to briefly view this image and then to try to start analyzing that experience as they are having it. And Brentano says that this is impossible, because what happens is that if you try to analyze your experience, what you're doing is you're trying to view your experience internally. And viewing the experience necessarily changes your experience. Think about how that works. If we use Brentano's terminology of intentionality, when the image of the cow is flashed before your mind, you are having the mental act of presentation, right? And the representation is your internal mental representation of that picture of the cow, and it's being presented to the mind's eye. But now you're supposed to analyze this experience, which means now what's happening is that there's a new mental act happening, which is still presentation, but it's no longer the image of the cow. It's yourself looking at the image of the cow, right? And so you've become one step removed from that. Instead of you looking at the cow and having that experience, it's you looking at yourself looking at the cow, which then changes the nature of the experience. And so because Brentano says that trying to observe your experiences as they happen will change them and alter them, then it is not possible to truly study them in this way. He does raise the possibility, though, that we can engage in indirect inner observation. So that is, after we have had an experience and therefore experienced its meaning, we can describe its meaning to us, right? We'll talk about the meaning of an experience. So this might, for example, with the cow, be everything that Tishner did not want you to do, right? To actually say, I see a cow, and I see it on the farm. And then anything else that you think about that goes along with that, right? Any other ideas that come to mind and associations that you make with cows and farms, that would all be part of the meaning of that experience to you. And that would be a phenomenal report, right? A phenomenal report or phenomenal introspection is about talking about the meaning of an experience. Lastly, of course, Brentano also hypothesized that it could be possible to, from observing the behavior of other people, attempt to infer what they're thinking, right? What's going on in the minds of others. Now, we might call that folk psychology, right? The idea is that's what we do all the time. We look at other people and we think about whether they do what they do on purpose or not, right? And in social psychology, that's called attribution theory. You make internal versus external attributions about people all the time. That's part of objective observation. But also it could be much more scientific if we try to observe people behaving in controlled environments, right? Manipulating variables, and then from there infer their intentionality, right? And so that would be part of this. Of course, there are problems here, described a little more in detail in the book, about whether we can really say that other people have minds. How do we know that intentions are real? This is the problem of other minds, and it's kind of a long-standing philosophical question. Later on, when we get to behaviorism, we'll see that they reject that, right? They reject other minds, and they say that it's not scientific to even talk about those things. So we eliminate mind from psychology altogether once we get to that chapter. Other big names in phenomenology would be Stumpf and Husserl. Now, Stumpf was really maybe less of a name here, but he was the professor of Husserl, and Husserl is sort of seen as one of the main figures in phenomenology. Stumpf is perhaps most famous for his work with another student in discrediting the Clever Hans effect. And so if you remember that, hopefully from research methods, Clever Hans was a horse in Germany at this time that was claimed by its owner to be able to do math. And so people would say, okay, Hans, tell me what's 2 plus 3. And the horse would stamp its hoof 5 times, and people would be amazed that this horse can do basic arithmetic. But Stumpf and his other student, I forget the name of that other student, they were able to explain what was going on here, because they noticed that if they put blinders on the horse, that it would no longer successfully count to the right number, but also if they put blinders on the audience, so that what that means is that the audience doesn't know the question that was asked. So if they're watching the horse and the horse is asked what's 2 plus 3, but the audience can't hear the question, then they don't know what the right answer is. And so what they found was that the horse fails either when it can't see the audience or when the audience doesn't know the question being asked of the horse. And this reveals what we nowadays call the double-blind procedure in research methods, right? That subjects should be blind to the hypothesis, and the researchers should also be blind to the condition that these subjects are placed in, so that way there's no influence. Because, of course, what was really going on with this horse is that it was attending to the expressions of the audience, and when it got to the right answer, the audience would show a reaction, and that reaction was the cue the horse used to stop. And so it was all just a trick. Now, Husserl, on the other hand, let's talk about Husserl. So he talks about that it is possible, perhaps, to do what he was talking about, which is to analyze our sensations. But it's more important to understand the meaning of an experience. So again, this is what we mean by phenomenal reports, and phenomenal introspection is to be able to talk about the true meaning of an experience to you. And Husserl uses the word Wesensschau, which just means it's the true essence of the experience. And so in this case, we're talking about things like, again, saying that you saw a cow on a farm, and all of the other things that come to mind when you see that kind of an image. Last up, I just want to mention a little bit more about what's going on in Germany, in German psychology at this time. So Wundt, of course, creates this laboratory, and he's training lots of people to be doing research in psychology. And so throughout the rest of Germany, his students go on to create laboratories in other schools, and we get a lot of early psychological research coming from all of this group. So we'll call them periphery, right? If Wundt is seen as sort of the hub of it all, the periphery would be his students who had moved on to doing other things. Perhaps the most famous of all of them is Ebbinghaus. And so if you've had a cognitive psychology class, you would have heard about Ebbinghaus's pioneering research in memory. And so he was really the first to study memory processes. He invented some of the methods that are used, right? One of these methods is the nature of a stimulus. So he wanted to study the ability to memorize really long lists of words. And he was aware that in trying to memorize a word list, that some words would be easier to remember than others, perhaps because they're more familiar words, or maybe they're very distinctive and unique words. And he didn't want memory performance to sort of be influenced or contaminated by those kinds of artifacts. And he came up with the idea rather that we should create meaningless words, right? Nonsense words, unfamiliar words. And therefore, familiarity would not influence this. And he also wanted to make them all equal in terms of their complexity or distinctiveness. So CVC here stands for consonant, vowel, consonant. So he would come up with a bunch of nonsense 3-letter words like GUK or QAL, right? And these would all just be presented in a long list of maybe 50 of them, and then he would try to memorize them all. And he would measure the amount of time it takes to learn and memorize the entire list. So that's a measure of learning, of course. So being able to map out the learning curve is something that he did. He also studied the different types of techniques for, what works better for learning these really long lists. And so he talked about the difference between what we now call distributed or mass practice. And so distributed practice, this is when you take your list, let's say it's 100 words. Well, if you break it up into 10 groups of 10, then what you do is you memorize one 10-word list, and then you memorize another 10-word list, and then another, and you break it up and spread it out over time. Or on the other hand, you could just do mass practice, which is to put all 100 words together and try to study them all at once. And what he found is that distributed practice works much better for remembering these kinds of things. Mass practice leads to maybe some effect, but very little recall. In fact, you probably know this from your own study experiences, because distributed practice is when you do a little bit of studying every single day, which works better for long-term retention. Mass practice is when you cram for an exam the whole night before, trying to study everything all at once, and it might last long enough for you to remember some of it for the exam, usually not all of it, and then you forget it as soon as you're done with the exam. You have no retention. He also tested this retention, or really forgetting, by using a measure he invented called savings time. And so with savings time, the idea is that you measure how long it takes to memorize the list on the first day you're studying it. Let's say it takes an hour. If you come back a week later, rather than just measuring how many words you can remember from the list, what he would do is relearn the list, and then see how long it takes him to relearn the list. And it probably won't take a whole hour this time. Maybe it takes 45 minutes instead. So now he saved 15 minutes off of the learning time, right? So that's his measure of the rate of forgetting is the savings time. So if you wait a week, maybe it takes 45 minutes, so you get 15 minutes savings time. But if you wait only a day, maybe you get 45 minutes savings time, right? It only takes you 15 minutes to relearn the list. So he was able to map out the amount of forgetting as a function of savings time in terms of the interval between the initial study period and the recall period, either days or weeks or maybe even months later. Now, when it comes to forgetting, why do we forget? Some people have proposed decay, right? That memory traces just fade away. But experience tends to teach us that this may not always be true, because oftentimes things that we have forgotten, we can eventually remember. And we say, oh yeah, I remember now. I've forgotten it before, but now I remember it. And this means that the memory trace was really there the whole time, right? It hadn't decayed and faded away into nothingness. It was still within us. We just somehow lost track of it. And this is what Mueller refers to as interference, that we have lots of memories, and they all interfere with each other. They get confused and mixed up with each other, and so that's one reason why we forget so many things. Lastly, we have Oswald Kolk, who was studying problem solving. This was something influenced by Wundt and the will, right? The idea is that when we're engaging in solving a problem, we're trying to think through a problem. You're in a problem state and you're trying to reach a solution. And you have to go through some reasoning steps to come up with a solution to your problem. And one of the things he asked people to do was to introspect, right? So again, using introspection to say, okay, think out loud as you solve through this problem and tell me all of the steps that you're going through to solve the problem. But what would happen is that a lot of participants would be able to sort of describe the problem state, but then all of a sudden the solution would just kind of come to them, right? They would kind of have that insight or aha moment where you just, oh, I know the answer now. But they're not actually able to introspect about how they got the answer, right? The answer just seems to come out of nowhere. They're not really consciously aware of what happens in between the problem state and solution state. And Cope called this imageless thought, right? That it was a form of thought that was really not accessible to the will and therefore could not be consciously described. This got him in a lot of trouble with Wundt, actually, because this was a violation of Wundt's whole theory of immediate experience, right? Problem solving is immediate experience. It's part of creative synthesis. And the will is centrally involved, and therefore the will should have conscious awareness of everything happening there. And Cope is arguing that it does not. So Wundt was very upset with Cope over this finding, and others loyal to Wundt also were upset with Cope over that. Now, the mental set research that he did was part of the problem-solving stuff. So what he would do is he would give people problems to be solved, and they were able to learn a particular pattern over different problems, and they would learn these patterns, and they would use that pattern and strategy to solve problems over and over again. But then Cope would change it up so that he would present them with a new problem that was technically easy to solve, but because they were used to this pattern or strategy, they would attempt to use that strategy for this new problem, and it would fail. And then they couldn't figure out how to solve the problem, even though it was an easy problem to solve. And if you take a person who had not learned this strategy and you just give them the problem, they'll solve it fairly quickly. But the person who's already kind of gotten to this habit, or as Cope calls it, a mental set of using the same problem-solving strategy over and over and over again, then it gets hard to break or free from that. And we get into the habit of using that same approach every time we're faced with a problem that looks like is relevant to that strategy. And that pretty much wraps up Chapter 8.